For the third of Ben Vinson's lectures. Thank you so much for joining us on this beautiful day outside. Really looking forward to this third lecture because yesterday's was great, and again, from what I heard, Monday's was also. So I think we've all had a lot to think about over these last couple of days. I just want to introduce Doris Summer, who will introduce Professor Vinson today. She's the Ira Jewell Williams Jr. Professor of Romance, Languages, and Literatures and of African and African American Studies. And she's also the director of the Cultural Agents Initiative, and she's a dear friend, and I hope you'll give her a warm welcome. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Abby. You are a dear friend, too, and I feel very close to everyone in this room. I'm also very honored to be able to introduce Professor Ben Vinson. He's not only a friend and getting closer, I hope, as a friend, but a really admired leader in this field, in this growing and important field of Afro-Latin American studies. I'll just say what you probably already know, which is that Ben Vinson is a historian, and he is now the Dean of the Columbian College of Arts and Science at George Washington University. Previously, he was at Johns Hopkins University and really the world's leading scholar on Afro-Mexican history. He's published several books on the subject, including Bearing Arms for His Majesty, the Free Colored Militia in Colonial Mexico, published in 2001. Another book called Flight, the story of Virgil Richardson, a Tuskegee airman in Mexico, published in 2004, and Afro-Mexico, published in Spanish by Fondo de Cultura Económica in 2004. He's also one of the participating scholars in La Bamba, the Afro-Mexican story, Afropop, hip, deep radio documentary all about Black history and music. And you probably know about his work as an administrator. It really boggles me that Ben can be such an effective administrator, a visionary, and a convener of other imaginative projects and still continue to do his research. You know, it's daunting even to think about that. So, you know, my admiration is doubled and tripled, really, to think about you as a leader in practical fields and in this important foundational field of research in the area. I want to say, just in my own words, again, because I don't want to repeat things that you've heard in other introductions. In my own words, I want to say that Ben Vinson's work was really foundational for me, because to see an entire book, a real project about Afro-Mexico, changed the map for me. He started on his first lecture looking at maps, at the trazas, at the clear, rational design of Spanish urban imagination. And the Spaniards took that everywhere. It didn't matter what they were laying it on. It always looked as if it were empty before. But what changed the map for me was that Mexico was a country that was complicated enough in its Afro-descendant history to dedicate a whole book and to show us lines of future investigation. And that, for me, in literary critical terms, was the dangerous supplement. We had thought that Afro-Latin America was Caribbean. The extension of that was Brazil, obviously, and Colombia. But it was all in that one circuit. To think about it as Mexican started to open up the map, started to, you know, wither those lines of the trazas and say, the history is much more complicated, much more interesting, and has many more circuits than the one we imagined around the Caribbean. So once you have a dangerous supplement in Lit Crit, what do you have? You have the opening to a multiplicity. You know, as soon as Mexico got on that map and occupied such an interesting, deep, and varied place, people started asking questions about, well, what about Paraguay? What about Peru? What about Ecuador? What about all these countries that we hadn't included in this traza and in this circuit, in this triangle? And so I want to thank Ben Vinson not only for his really groundbreaking work, map-breaking work on Mexico, but really opening up the whole field to us and making us responsible to new map-making and really generations of future research. Thank you so much, Ben Vinson.
Of course, thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thanks. Well, guys, I very much appreciate that introduction, wow, I wish I could take credit for all of that stuff, but there are a lot of people who've been working on these issues, and I was just trying to do my part. But thank you for those very kind words. In this, my final lecture, I just wanted to say a few things before getting into it. The first of which, how much of a pleasure it is for me to be here. As Doris noted, as a full-time administrator, actually, it's very rare that I have the opportunity to actually do this kind of presentation and to really convey some of the things that I've been working on for so long. And so these are rare opportunities, and I definitely am cherishing every moment of this. And there's been such hospitality here, and I want to thank everyone who's been involved, and those of you who've patiently stuck through this now for the third day. I see some faces here from the beginning, and thank you for that. I also want to just mention how inspirational the question and answer period and some of the side discussions that have happened over dinner have been for me. There are actually two students in the audience who are high school students who I've had a chance to talk to, and in fact, one of their questions yesterday inspired me to write about 2:30 in the morning, and when they were saying, you know, well, what's happening and what's happening now, what's happening today, how does this fit today? So thanks to them, I've written a coda to the book to come, and I have to clean it up, but certainly inspired by them, and I want to thank all of the students as well who've borne through this. With my final lecture today, what I'd like to really do is to delve into the lives of some of the more extreme castes that I've been working on, some of those pictures that you've seen and on the screen now that represent some of the fringes of the Casta order. In doing so, one of the things I really hope to do and convey to you today are some thoughts about Castizaje. And that is that term that I introduced yesterday, and that I'm using to really capture the full spectrum of caste mobility in colonial times. This includes the processes by which caste groups shifted, by which they transformed, by which they moved and intermingled with each other. It represented the colonial period's link, and in some ways its gift to the modern ideology of Mestizaje. This motion and world of motion of Castizaje. So as caste unfolded in everyday situations, it was constantly being recoded. It was constantly being recalibrated, reinvented, eventually ballooning into unforeseen descriptors. Just when you thought you knew what a term meant, it could mean something else. Based on who you were interacting with, based on where you were. This is something that John Thornton, also over dinner last night, brought up. He said, Ben, you know, when you look in the documents and see these sea of categories inconsistently applied, does it mean anything? And I think it does. Sometimes the recoding of caste was subtle. For instance, there were mulattoes that were born in the colonies that were not the usual and expected progeny that you might expect between blacks and whites, but instead they were the children of blacks and chinos. We've seen that. There were also scores of mulattoes who were the descendants of blacks and Indians. Now, the assumption in the Spanish realm that Lobos always had a clear native bloodlines, as seen in this caste painting. You know, here it says a Lobo was the mixture of a black and Indio. That wasn't always true. And there were places where coyotes, which were ideally the mixture between mestizos and Indios, as seen as that young baby there. You know, sometimes that didn't even hold. Sometimes the coyote was close to almost whiteness, or it was close to, or they were more analogous to mestizos themselves. In short, as caste roles unfurled in society, there were scores of local, of regional variances that could make particular caste statuses operate differently from place to place. Now, in most cases, these dissonances were resolved. They didn't generally overwhelm the stability of the social order in colonial times. Sometimes the number of variances was simply just not large enough to make a substantive dent in the grander scheme. Or society provided enough latitude for different audiences to digest various caste labels that regional and local differences were ultimately translated very effectively when these dissonances occurred. Oftentimes, local interpretations and understandings of caste, what was happening every day, what was happening on the ground, this influenced the thinking of the central government, of the government itself, who, especially when dealing with court cases, found themselves heavily relying upon local knowledge to guide them through understanding the racial landscape of particular regions. Now, there were other occasions when authorities were less willing to be persuaded by local viewpoints and were guided by different assessments. Let's be honest about that. But by whatever means that consensus on caste statuses were achieved, what I'm striving to convey to you is that these processes of reconciling divergent caste interpretations simply became habits of the colonial period, such that in the typical flow of colonial affairs, reconciling conflicting interpretations of caste did not present a major event. In their frequency, these practices of reconciling caste were rather ordinary. They were mere reflexes, part of the natural order of things. Now, there were also situations, mind you, in colonial society when caste categories, especially these extreme castes that I've dedicated a lot of time to, these castes were sometimes deployed strategically. The terminologies were deployed strategically, being used almost like metaphors. In these cases, the intent was not necessarily to describe or accurately capture the product of racial mixture. And sometimes that was the case, but sometimes it wasn't. But rather, the purpose behind this was to use the extreme registers of caste as tools to comment upon how particular situations should be interpreted. Those who utilized caste labels in this way often wanted caste to explain and justify certain behaviors and circumstances to different colonial constituencies. Now, instances of deviancy oftentimes elicited these forms of descriptions. In the small, sleepy Mexican town of Coatepec, in what is today modern Veracruz, and which you're taking a peek at now, at least the town center. In the year 1770, Maria Dolores Colesiala, who was labeled a loba, or lobo, was denounced to the Inquisition for bewitching Maria Lopez, who was a white woman, an Española. She had apparently sealed Maria's mouth shut by applying a concoction of hair, a pig's tail, and a snake's tail. Now, as this case unfolded before the Inquisition, an intricate feud and a smear campaign began amongst these two women. Maria Dolores' reputation was thoroughly derided. She was described as a thief who stole money and petty goods from locals. She was portrayed as an expert in making dolls, something like voodoo dolls for bewitchment. And through her magic, she was accused of killing several townsmen. Disturbingly, on some occasions, locals attested to seeing a witch leaving Maria Dolores' room at night. And these visits were followed by a bevy of mischief. While other details of this case are captivating, it's a thick case, as many are in the Inquisition and the archives. What's important for our purposes is, as the litigation proceeded, Maria Dolores' caste shifted slightly over the course of testimony. Now, this is where John Thornton, who was sitting in the audience yesterday, said, "Ben, that doesn't matter, that doesn't mean anything." I beg to differ. Some said that she was a mestiza. Others claimed that she was a loba, or lobo. Whatever the truth, the inquisitors clung to the loba label in the end. Arguably, its association with blackness, remember that Afro-Mexicans were among the most accused for heterodoxy in Mexico. This association with blackness, this term's association with blackness, added a dimension of culpability and ire to the case, and it certainly was emphasized by the plaintiff, and it was probably equally endorsed by the Inquisition. Let me take another case. In the colonial city of Querétaro, known to some as the textile capital of Mexico, Miss Monica, or Doña Monica Guadalupe Mundurriaga, who was a mulatta woman, appeared for the Inquisition in the 1750s to denounce Joaquin Lozano, who was described as a Morisco healer. He was also a cigar maker. She confessed that about 7 years earlier, Lozano, who was then a sexton in the church of Santo Domingo, forced her to have sex with him on 3 separate occasions. At least once, they fornicated directly on the church altar, where she'd also seen him drink from the holy chalice. Then, Lozano turned to her and invited her to drink and do the same. Now, as their relationship grew more intense over time, Lozano reportedly buried a small statue of a saint in her room, stating that through this act, he would be assured that she would never betray him. He then turned around and presented her with a piece of paper and asked her to sign her name in blood. Once completed, he said, she would join him in becoming enslaved to the devil. She complied, but instead of using her own blood, she substituted a sanguine-looking ink. As the ritual act unfolded, she chanted, "I submit to you. I am to be the slave of the devil." Monica never saw Lozano again until during her most recent confession, when he suddenly appeared and asked her to renounce her declaration of sin. Now, let's step back a minute. Although this fantastical story was packed with inconsistencies, the inquisitors still investigated. Was Lozano real? Was he the devil? Or was he something else from the supernatural realm? In being described as a Morisco, Lozano perhaps credibly appeared to the Inquisition as a trickster figure, not unlike the devil or another demon. It is true that other descriptions drawn from Mexico's Inquisition files frequently described the devil as a dark man. But very few described him outright as a Morisco. You almost never see that. But this portrayal definitely fell within the realm of possibility. Moreover, seeing that Monica was a mulatta woman, the Inquisition might have also deemed her relationship with Lozano as more plausible, despite the colony-wide ubiquity of sexual relations across Mexico's color divide. At a minimum, in conjuring the specificity of the term Morisco in her testimony, Monica inserted a tangible identifier in her story that facilitated the Inquisition's ability to locate Lozano if he were real. Finally, as a Morisco, Lozano enjoyed a proximity to whiteness that she might have also consciously used to introduce some irony into this tale. You know, he's close to white, yet he's doing this stuff, okay? In sum, now whether she was delusional or not, it's not the point. What we see in this case is that Monica deployed the Morisco typology to useful ends in ways that prompted the authorities to at least partially investigate her claims. It produced a spin. A third and final case will help underscore some of the points that I've raised from the rural, and this comes from the rural jurisdiction of Guadalupe in the late 18th century. This was a somewhat prototypical farming and ranching area in northern Mexico. During the month of January of 1770, a man by the name of Josef de Rojas, who was a farm worker, who was described by some as a mulatto and others as a lobo, was denounced by his estate's administrator for depraved intentions. After 2 days of hard rain on the hacienda of Santa Ana, Rojas was seen leaving the estate for the countryside, where he began uttering incomprehensible phrases while gesticulating with various signs and figurines. According to first-hand accounts from some of the region's indios, the native population, Rojas's actions brought a swift end to a series of torrential storms that had been threatening their crops. So word started to spread quickly throughout the local communities and it circled back and causing some commotion amongst the natives on the hacienda where he worked, which is kind of this estate. But not everyone deigned him a hero. Remember, so he's going around doing all this crazy stuff to some, but it's stopping storms. The Indians are saying, wow, this guy's doing the right thing. He's saving our crops. But that wasn't the only perspective. Fears also brewed that Rojas's wizardry posed a threat to the spiritual order and to the crops themselves. In thwarting the ruinous rains, he might have also inadvertently precipitated drought conditions, which could prove equally, if not more damaging to the crops. He had to be stopped, and the Inquisition needed to properly investigate these matters. Now, for us, what matters most was the uncertainty surrounding his casta, his caste. Rojas was a mulatto in some circles, but he was a lobo in other circles. The question at hand is to what extent his characterization as a lobo was meant to connect him to native communities or to raise fears about his influence amongst local Indios. Remember, lobo was something that was connected by definition into the native world oftentimes. On the other hand, when he was characterized as a mulatto, so remember, he's being toggled between both of these. Now, was there a corresponding effort to use this term as a means to distance his connection with natives and to emphasize his links with other members of the region's population? It is revealing that the estate administrator opted to highlight Rojas's status as a lobo. In this region of New Spain, it is likely, very likely, that there was a strong degree of synonymy between lobos and mulattos, with both of these terms referring essentially sometimes to the same population group. But in denouncing Rojas, what the estate administrator probably fully understood is that by invoking that particular term, so even though if the local culture confounded these two, when he picked up that term and deployed it before the Inquisition, it registered differently. Most inquisitors at this time would have interpreted the lobo label as bearing stronger links to the native world than the mulatto designation. Most of the inquisitors who are based in Mexico City who were listening to this case. So this might have influenced their overall opinion of the case and its contents, even tipping the scales in favor of punishing him, depending on their outlook on how they saw and how they perceived the fraternization level between Africans and natives. So I raised these three cases. Some of the discussion here in these three cases is speculative, based on a very informed reading of the files. Admittedly, there are a number of ways to interpret the details of these cases and scores of them that exist in the colonial archives, but I do think that the fundamental point remains sound. What some scholars have considered to be accidental slippages or mistakes, or even an unconscious commingling of caste categories in the colonial record, may not have always been the case. When working in the colonial archives, we should not read lightly over what one might perceive to be small discrepancies in caste descriptions, produced by what one might deem to be relaxed approaches to assigning caste labels. Nor should we readily seek to smooth over these discrepancies when we stumble upon them. In fact, it is these discrepancies that occasionally offer us to the ability to see new angles of information in the documentation. When extreme caste categories were blended with others to describe individuals, what I'm really suggesting is that sometimes colonists intentionally used this approach to convey information in a different light. And this was done subtly to alter viewpoints on real-life situations. It was done to impact the outcome of disputes that people had with one another, or otherwise to massage narratives that were told to others. Undeniably, caste's meaning and the meaning of individual caste labels also was stretching in the colony, and was applied, especially as it was starting to be applied in a number of common encounters. So what you're seeing in this and in other cases, which I'll dance around in a couple seconds, these terms are becoming, are elongating in many senses. Also, one of the things that we see is that a veritable thicket of caste combinations and outcomes became possible in the colonial world, with a constant jungle-like growth of completely new categories. So as some categories are expanding in their meaning, other new categories are being formed as the colonial period starts maturing. In no short order, there were probably far more caste terminologies that were used by colonists than even the most ambitious rendering of the caste system has conveyed to date. So I mentioned yesterday there were probably, according to some, over 168 different caste combinations that were possible in Mexico. There were 20 or so, 18 to 20 that I see faithfully in the record, but in truth, we probably have no estimation of how many just recombinant varieties were possible. But the points to keep in mind is that much like heavy radioactive isotopes, these classifications, some of the more extreme ones, enjoyed only a very brief existence, being either too cumbersome to become common in everyday situations, or used too rarely in remote parts of the colonies to find their way into the mainstream. It's not a surprise that the archives don't capture all of the more esoteric categories, but sometimes we can glimpse them in the record. In Durango, a part of Mexico, during the middle of the 18th century, sometimes the term bermejo, which was usually used to describe one's color as a reddish-brown color. This particular term in the 18th century, in the middle of the 18th century, started appearing as an expression of caste. In 1605, in the town of Cacapo, within the Mexican province of Michoacan, the term tresalvo, which literally means 3 white feet, appeared as a caste category that was describing a type of hybridized mestizo, most likely the offspring between mestiza women and Indio males. Gender is important in this particular configuration. Among the more unique terminologies that I've found, especially for people of African descent, was a designation called Caste rayado, which is, it literally means a striped caste. Now, there are not that many rayados that have been recorded in colonial Mexico. And of the small number of cases that we have, the best evidence comes from 2 areas. Veracruz, which is, again, part of the Gulf Coast region of Mexico, and in Mexico City during the late 17th and into the 18th centuries. Many of these Afro-rayados were natives of Africa. Nearly all of them were described as negro or moreno, which means that they were emphasized that they were not racially mixed individuals. They were of what some would in that day call pure black. Making use of physical descriptions found in the archive for some individuals that were denounced before the Inquisition and who were depicted as rayados, Afro-rayados. One of these individuals, his name is Blas. One of the things that we also see, because it's very important when you're looking at the rayado, because there was also a native category of rayado. These were people who were known in what is today the southwestern parts of the United States. They often wore tattoos and had facial scarification. When you look at the Afro-rayados, it's interesting that none of those particular things applied. There was no physical marker, so there was no stripe to speak of that was used to identify the native population. It's clear that Spaniards saw natives as striped, but these African-based rayados were not. So what does rayado mean? The best that I've been able to find is that these are people who came from a region of Africa known as the Raya de Guinea, or the frontier border or line of Guinea. And you have to remember, in this period, Guinea really was just a synonym for all of Africa. So as you start to try to backtrack and figure out where is that exactly, very, very hard to do. But some of the detective work that can be done suggests that if there was a region that in Africa that we could pinpoint where these Afro-rayados came from, it was most likely just north of the Senegal and Niger rivers. There's even a slimmer chance that these Afro-rayados are East Africans, especially from the northeast of Ethiopia. Now, it is also possible that the rayados may have developed their sense of ethnicity while living in the Americas. So Blas, that person who I mentioned earlier, was curiously not described as a rayado until he was an adult. and after he had moved in and around the New World a little bit, finally arriving in Mexico. In his previous unsettled, unruly life as a slave in Cuba, he was widely known to be a negro criollo, a Creole black or a black born in the New World. This was a clear indicator that he had been born somewhere in the Spanish colonies. When he was sold into slavery in Veracruz, he seems to have developed close friendships with other black rayados, which may have impacted his identity. His second marriage to Maria Margarita, who was described as being of Congo caste and was also a slave of Blas's master, placed him in closer proximity with other Africans with whom he developed ties. Now, this is not to say that he did not have similar ties to Africans in Cuba, but there may have been something special about his relationships in Mexico that triggered him and those around him to identify him as being of Rayado caste. And so, again, what I'm trying to suggest here is that some of these particular identities were forged in the New World, in the conditions of the New World, and even in particular sub-regions where friendships mattered, where marriage links mattered, and where identities could change over a lifetime. Now, certainly, I think for me, one of the stunning finds of my research was stumbling across this person I'm going to be spending a fair bit of time talking about over the next few minutes. His name is Juan Domingo Rayado of Mexico City. He was certainly probably one of the most influential black rayados in Mexico, if not in the New World. Until the time of his death in 1716, Juan Domingo Rayado was a respected member of the black community. He worked as a smelter in the royal treasury and was the owner of several properties throughout the city of Mexico, Mexico City. Here's where the royal treasury exists and where his work took place. And there were a number of peoples of African descent who worked in making money in Mexico, literally making money. Juan Domingo Rayado also owned a ranch, and he also owned a small carbon-making enterprise just outside of Mexico City. Here you are seeing not that ranch per se, I can't find it, but certainly images of the region of Huixquiluca, which is where his property was located. Domingo Rayado first arrived to Mexico enslaved, and he had been sold into slavery at a young age from Africa. He had also spent time in Spain before being transported across the Atlantic. When he worked in the New World, he worked for Captain Don Francisco de la Campa, who ended up issuing him his freedom and paving the way at that time for what would become a remarkable life story. At some point in time, and during his residence in Mexico City, he married a fellow Rayado named Ana Maria. And through hard work, this couple survived difficult times, and she eventually acquired her freedom. They had no natural children, but they did take in a number of orphans, including a young mulata who was named Maria, who was left on his doorstep at the age of 7. And during Domingo Rayado's lifetime, he became a devout Catholic and a prominent member of a black confraternity, a religious organization, a sodality to which many peoples of African descent belonged. This confraternity that he belonged to was one of the most prominent Afro-Mexican confraternities, the confraternity of Our Lady of the Immaculate Conception, which was housed here. Now, perhaps as a symbol of his faith and his loyalty to this confraternity, Domingo Rayado named both his ranch and his carbon estate after Our Lady of the Immaculate Conception. During his lifetime, Rayado made all of his enterprises remarkably successful. His cattle ranch raised cows, donkeys and horses, mules and bulls. It also produced potatoes, barley, and straw. And with the proceeds of his enterprises, Domingo Rayado was able to purchase 3 lavish homes in Mexico City. Now, I just wanted to give you a taste of what one of these lives was like. What makes his case so important to me is precisely how he then started to interact with fellow members of the black community of Mexico City. In the late 17th and early 18th centuries, these were critical times in the development of black life in the capital. This was a time when there were a number of tensions between blacks and morenos on the one hand, these are the darkest spectrum of peoples of African descent, and pardos and mulattos on the other, the more mixed spectrum, the visibly different class of African, or peoples of African descent. The feuds could be traced through the principal institutions that convened and organized free-colored life, such as the militias and the confraternities. It is clear that many of the so-called pure blacks greatly disliked the racially mixed pardos and mulattos. They felt that these individuals did not share their goals and that they did not share their political interests. There were efforts by both parties to keep these groups separate and in competition with one another for privileges, in competition for status, and in competition for resources. Over his lifetime, Juan Domingo Rayado became a champion of the pure black Moreno cause. Although admittedly, one of his adopted daughters was probably a mixed race Parda, who in turn married a Pardo. So he definitely had ties with the other world, but he started to champion this Moreno black, pure black contingent. Through a series of fictive kin relationships and friendship networks, Domingo Rayado became a patron of many Morenos and pure blacks in Mexico City. He also appears to have rented out some of his property to new freedmen, in addition to providing them with jobs on his ranch. So in a sense, he played a role in facilitating the life transition for many blacks from slavery into freedom. Ironically, Domingo Rayado, a former slave, also became a slave owner himself. But he was also a well-known slave patron, providing cash loans to help slaves secure liberty. He also provided jobs on his estates to furnish them with some income. Upon his death, Domingo Rayado continued to express his affiliation with Mexico City's Black Moreno community. He willed some of his estate over to the Black Confraternity of Our Lady of the Immaculate Conception, and there was a specific clause in his testament that was designed to ensure that his ranch's operations would exclusively and in perpetuity benefit this particular special segment of Mexico City's Afro-Mexican population. He said that the proceeds of his properties were supposed to go to those who had originally been born in Africa, not people who had been born in the New World. Apart from providing these individuals with a reliable source of employment, some of the vacant rooms of his properties were to be left open to these individuals directly from Africa, so that they would have a place of refuge and solace during hard times. And so after his death, years after his death, one can see records of his property almost like a hotel, where peoples who were originally from Africa resided, made money, and eked out an existence. Domingo Rayado's estate choices and his decisions upon the brink of his death reveal much about how his personal connections and his ties transcended the typical bounds of social status that governed colonial society. But perhaps Domingo Rayado's case, more than others, shows very clearly how a specific classification that bore ethnic overtones gradually transformed into something greater. Through personal connections, through friendships, through business transactions, through ties made through slavery, through confraternity associations and workplace affinities, Domingo Rayado's status as being a member of the Rayado caste morphed into a broader sense of camaraderie with others who had come from predicaments like his own. Over his lifetime, his ethnic and caste designations never left him, nor did his status as a Moreno. What happened was that these descriptors converged to generate an attachment to other ethnic Africans who were also Morenos. It is likely that almost nothing about this process was conscious. It was probably the result of a series of independent life choices that he made tactically in the heat of the moment rather than strategically. Quite frankly, life's fortunes enabled Domingo Rayado to overcome many barriers that impeded the progress of individuals like him. His striving to supersede these obstacles, along with the tacit recognition that through collective action and by using networks to unite individuals like himself, he could improve his situation in the lives of others, these considerations may have helped him make some deeper meaning out of the caste and the color labels that society had assigned to him. Because of the silences of the archives and the shortcomings of the colonial documents, we will never fully know the psychological processes that operated in his mind. But seemingly, though, we have been left with clues as to motives of his behavior. So I present these as some examples of some lives of what it was probably like to be a member of these extreme castes during this particular period of history. One of the things I'd like to turn to now is then now reflecting back on the categories themselves and what was happening to them. In contrast to very exceedingly rare terms like rayado or tresalvo, colonists oftentimes resorted to creating something that I'm calling compound castes or composite castes that conjoined two or more caste categories. Equally salient was the tendency to supplement caste categories with physical or even geographic descriptors. The ensuing composite then started to represent or serve as a person's formal caste designation. So this is, again, a part of that stretching process that I was talking about. Well, now, not only are categories stretching, but now they're being mashed together into something new. It is in this way that you get terms like mulatto achinado, or the Chinese-looking mulatto. You also get the chino blanco, or the white Chinese, or the mulatto morisco, the morisco mulatto. There are even remarkably complex compound casta configurations. Luis de Leon, who was a 14-year-old slave who was liberated in Mexico City in 1657, was described as a mulatillo castizo de color chino. Mulatillo castizo de color chino mestizo. So what that really means is a young mulatto castizo of Chinese mestizo color. It's pretty thick right there. Rather than originating primarily through self-identification, you don't see people, calling themselves this. These compound castes really often emanated from people who were in a position to evaluate someone else's caste. So you often see this happening when witnesses are describing someone in a legal case, or when they're in weddings, somebody's talking about someone. Oh yeah, this guy's a chino, mulatto, mestizo, whatever. Or when government and ecclesiastical officials or neighbors and friends were describing acquaintances or people they knew in various social settings and in various forums. Now, in a sample that was taken from about 168 notary records from 17th century Mexico, well, what I produce here is some appreciation of the range and variety of the caste labels that existed. So let me see if this is the right table. Whoops. Oh, there we go. Did I have this up just a second ago? Yeah. So this gives you a sense here. This table doesn't actually capture every single case, but it spotlights rather the earliest mention of specific terminologies as they started to appear in the sample that I compiled. Most of these slaves were born in Mexico City, but there were some who actually came from Europe, and others coming from places like Jamaica, other parts of the Caribbean, and even from Angola. Now, from the 17th to the 18th centuries in Mexico, terms like mulatto cocho started to appear in places like Mexico City and beyond. Mulatto cocho literally means a cooked black or cooked mulatto. Cocho, as with terms like membrillo, which was used to describe the yellowish complexion, or if you had a tinge of yellow in your skin, the yellowish complexion of a quince fruit, if anyone has ever had that. These terms and things like this started to add great specificity to the descriptive power of caste. They provided helpful identifiers when core terminologies proved limited, or when they failed to capture an individual's complete phenotype. So cocho and membrillo seldom appeared as discrete caste categories. You're not going to see anyone walking around as a cocho, but you will see them as a mulatto cocho or negro cocho. It was no accident also that these types of terminologies, these additional descriptive terminologies, started to become vogue after 1650 and into the early 1700s. Essentially, these were the years when the slave trade in Mexico started to diminish, with fewer fresh arrivals coming from Africa. And indeed, a great bulk of the slave trade's volume to Mexico had largely ended around 1640. And so, by necessity, the slave population was becoming more racially exogamous. It was becoming more hybridized and diverse in color after the middle of the 1600s. And so the free black population also started to become increasingly more miscegenated in these times. So in order to capture some of the nuance of the vast phenotypic changes that were taking place amongst the peoples of African descent, rather than inventing new and additional categories or expanding the use of some of the categories that already existed but that were infrequently applied, some individuals found it convenient to combine lineage-based descriptions of caste with these explicit, more phenotypic references. And these practices continued and intensified as the colonial period wore on. So this is just, again, looking at that small sample, actually laborious to get at this small sample, from the 17th century Mexico City slave records, which kind of, the anomaly, of course, is 1690 to 1696, which is only a small, it's not even a decade, but you see there's a kind of an intensification that happens really after 1650, and it kind of continues even into the 1700s. So terminologies like mulatto cocho, negro prieto, which means dark black, mulatto amestizado, which is a mulatto with a dash of mestizo features, these essentially showcased phenotype within the caste hierarchical order. As compound and composite castes appeared, they started to directly expose a tautology that was embedded within the conceptualization of caste. So yesterday, one of the things I tried to do was to demonstrate how caste classifications were imagined as being able to successfully incorporate lineage and phenotype. So one of the keys here was that you might remember briefly as if you knew someone's caste, you could go back and calculate, who they, what their father, what their parentage was like over a couple of generations. So, and this lineage was supposed to be an indicator of phenotype. So, this particular ancestry produces this particular look. But in practice, phenotype and lineage were inconsistent and unreliable guides to one another, and particularly in a social system where there were very few controls over miscegenation. So the question that was raised by the young man yesterday about endogamy and exogamy and rules on those, when you don't have those particular rules, things start to run haywire, and so it's you have a hard time controlling lineage and making it being a predictor of phenotype, assuming that you can control phenotype. Also, there's another problem in Latin America, and that is most people didn't know their ancestry beyond 2 generations. So it's highly unlikely that anyone deeply understood their own lineage. So as miscegenation started to intensify during the colonial period, and as deep genealogical knowledge of one's own ancestors started to slip, in order to properly understand one's place in the social order, a greater need arose to be more precise about understanding phenotypes. So that's why you start seeing these nomenclatures. Some categories like mulatto cocho, mulatto preto, mulatto membrillo, mulatto blanco, they functioned in this vein, helping capture what lineage no longer could. These same qualifiers also, though, provided other interesting opportunities. So depending on who used this language, some of these qualifiers either helped police the boundaries of caste classifications, or they provided interesting social advancement opportunities for individuals that they described. So, you've got people here during this period who are slave masters who are using terms like mulatto blanco to describe their Creole slaves so that, when they started to run away, they could have a more accurate descriptor to be able to return them, right, or to get them back. But then you've got other people who use this same term. Let's take this term mulatto blanco, or literally a white mulatto. So while slave masters were using this to better identify their slaves, you got people who are free who are then using these terms like, oh, this is an interesting term, who are then using mulatto blanco to apply for privileges, saying, you know what, I'm not just a mulatto, I'm a blanco, right? I'm white, I'm close to white, and therefore I can gain privileges in this way. So you see this being played out in a very, very interesting way. Looked at from another angle, the modifications to the term mulatto that appeared in the 17th and 18th century also suggest something else. During an era of intensifying racial mixture in Mexico, the mulatto category in particular is proved especially susceptible to destabilization, given its inherent hybrid quality. Preserving the integrity of the mulatto group and the functionality of mulattoness as a meaningful caste designation appeared to be of concern to members of the elite, since mulattoes represented an important boundary between blackness and whiteness, in ways that other categories just didn't do. Mestizos, for instance, definitely forged a similar divide between whites and natives, but mestizos were deemed less socially threatening, especially at the end of the 16th century. When mestizos engaged in miscegenation with whites, the resulting mixture was construed more positively, as evidenced by their progeny being classified as castizos, which was almost at the pinnacle of the caste hierarchy. So there's Español and there's castizo. So there's a very different calculus that's going on. By contrast, the offspring of mulattos and whites, which was typically supposed to be called moriscos, or Moorish individuals, was a terminology that was loaded with negative connotations, and it reflected society's general concern that this was a threatening threshold that needed to be policed. So in no short order, the exercise of creating various degrees of mulattos prevented a greater proliferation of moriscos, which is one of these categories that on the extremes. Arguably, if this mechanism didn't exist, this ability to modify mulattoness, we probably would have had more moriscos in the colonies, in Mexico, and it probably would have floated more into a mainstream category, but it didn't. Rather than choosing to call someone a morisco, some people just found it also easier, or even more meaningful to label them a mulatto or mulatto blanco. Whatever the case, at least into the middle of the 1700s, by using a complex and mushrooming matrix of mulatto terminologies, Mexican society refused to let the mulatto category slide into total disrepair. So what I'm trying to impart upon you is that the mulatto status was in the balance. It could have fragmented completely, but these controls, these composite instruments, these other ways of thinking about mulattoness, which extended and elongated the caste terminologies in accordion fashion, it saved mulattoness in a way. It inhibited the growth of morisconess, and this is one of the legacies that endured. Let me now try to tie some of the strands of this afternoon's lecture together. Unfortunately, my resolution will not be neat. It's not going to be completely satisfying or clean. Since these lectures are slices of a larger project, they're going to have to stand for what they are. These are windows into something more. But here today, what I hope we've been able to look at is taking a closer examination at the operation of caste in local society to gain an understanding of what I am suggesting was a constant recoding of caste as it was applied in a plethora of colonial circumstances. And if you draw anything away from this, is that, oh my goodness, not only was, from the series of lectures, not only were the foundations of caste truly complex, not only were the philosophical underpinnings of it operating on many vectors which actually could have destabilized caste, but even in the everyday, even as things were used in action, you're seeing incredible variety. All of these recodings ultimately produced a rich density of caste terminologies, as well as concepts that made use of the more esoteric terminologies. By way of recap again, as caste started to unfold in everyday situations, it yielded both compound castes and exceedingly rare caste labels. It produced subtle recalibrations of seemingly staid caste groups. It exposed how elites and plebeians utilized extreme caste labeling for different ends. It exposed how caste classifications found themselves being employed as metaphors for enlightening audiences on specific topics. Additionally, caste varied richly across regional landscapes, causing terminological dissonances. But in their sheer regularity, these caste variances and the processes by which they existed and were resolved, this signified nothing out of the ordinary in the overall colonial order. Finally, Today, we have also appreciated how caste labels, especially at the extremes, ebbed and flowed in popularity over time, particularly as different demographic realities and social and economic conditions and even political orders shifted during the course of the colonial period. Returning now to the points that I made yesterday, much of what we have discussed, I think, should be conceived of as associated with Mestizaje. That is, what I conceive to be the vehicle, the primary vehicle for caste change during colonial times. I have already argued that caste itself underwent important transformations in the colonial period, largely linked to grander ideological shifts afoot in arenas like science and religion, but also due to transformations that were associated with the evolution of Spanish colonialism. What today's lecture shows are other forms of caste change that were produced more by micro-pressures, more by local concerns. In the aggregate, these caste recodings and their attenuate recalibrations further created circumstances that facilitated even more forms of caste mobility, of more forms of interchange and fluidity. In these recodings, themselves help develop the platform by which individuals could live or be construed of as living different, even plural, caste lives. One of the things that this project genuflects towards is that as these terminologies were used, as people started to live in and through these terminologies, especially those groups that were extreme, especially people like Moriscos, especially people like Lobos, they started to seep in and out, phase in and out of different caste categories, and those categories at particular moments in time were meaningful, and that they then adopted, absorbed those identities for periods of time. They lived plurally. They lived differently throughout the spectrum of their lives. And this is an important, I think, observation of an important colonial reality of Mexico. Finally, at the end here, it is my hope that this 3 days of lectures have made you think a little bit more about the origins of modern racial orders by gazing into an unfamiliar past. As I said when I began, the legacy of all these processes is truly what I think is that these particular, as I said when I began, the legacy of all these processes that I've been describing is the creation in Latin America of one of the most powerful ideologies of human difference that ever existed, and that is the ideology of Mestizaje. But before Mestizaje existed, there were a sea of concepts. There was a world of fluidity and motion that I would like to describe again as Mestizaje, anchored, if you will, upon an effort to create a caste-like order. That project was slippery from the start. It was constantly ad-libbed. It was in a state of constant revision. This legacy must be inserted as part of the founding bricks of Mestizaje. Efforts to disassociate the two are ultimately non-productive. Based on what I've been able to find in the archives, I believe that all of the splintering, all of the toggling that took place in colonial times actually created a recognizable precursor to Mestizaje. Latin America's caste system, if you will, if you want to call it that, and the term caste itself ultimately became an idea that harnessed difference, and at the same time it encouraged differentiation. It became the means for the governing elite to view its varied populations singularly while mincing them almost endlessly. At the dawn of the 20th century, Mestizaje would jettison the segmenting aspects of caste in favor of a more inclusive approach. But the course of history that eventually led to this outcome had, to some extent, been laid. It had been set. And Mexico, in particular, emerged out of these 3 centuries of colonial rule with this particular heritage. Thank you. I do think there is time for questions, so I'd love to hear your thoughts. Yes.
Thank you, Ben. I missed yesterday's, but I was here for the first day and today. Just a great set of lectures. So thank you very much. I have a couple of questions, but let me ask just one. As you introduced the first 3 cases that went through Inquisition, what I began to sort of explore in my mind is how multiracialism seemed to be mapping onto syncretism or religious syncretism, and how this was seen as informing dissidents. So, multiracialism, religious syncretism, dissidents. And if you could speak to how these were kind of moving categories, but that were being brought into alignment. And somehow I could see how the perception of people's indigenous religions seemed to be informing the judgments of the inquisitors, of whether a case lent itself to either witchcraft or something. So I see these 3 categories, and if you could kind of bring them into alignment a little bit for this period and how they began to inform each other.
It's a good question. It's an astute observation. And again, just for me to rephrase to make sure I'm clear on the question, is you are seeing those particular cases as also aligned with the general practice of syncretism, religious melding that's taking place in the New World. I think that's a very, very astute observation, and let me add at least these reflections on that. In these cases and in other cases, the Inquisition struggled mightily on where do this stuff fit? Well, how do these practices fit? And they never really had a full handle on what was happening culturally under their own observations, under their own rule. What I would like to say is that, and some people have written well on this, is that there were certain within the practice of Christianity as it unfolded in the New World, there were certain domains or spheres where certain types of behavior were winked at or recognized. So if you had indigenous ancestry or were Indio, there was a certain tolerability to an extent in the more mature colonial period, not in the first decade or the first century, where there was deep efforts to root out idolatry and other practices. But as the period wore on, there was a little bit more of a threshold in tolerance for native expressions of, or let's say, recraftings of Christianity. And there was a perception that there are people who write on black magic versus white magic and what was tolerated. The native population tended to be able to be seen as healers and things of this nature, and so there was some tolerance there. In terms of the African presence, that particular group presented in some ways more problems. And when you look at the Inquisition record, most of the cases of bewitchment and things of this nature they're filled with peoples of African ancestry. Now, there are 2 reasons, easy reasons. One is that for that particular outcome, one is that the Inquisition really didn't prosecute natives within their particular domain, but the other was that they were seeing some of the magic that was often produced by black agents as possibly detrimental, and so those are the spheres of influence within which, broadly speaking, the ideological terrain in which things existed. Now interracial mixture, because that complicates it. What do you do with something like the Lobo that we talked about, or which is the mixture of black Indian? Where do they fit? The Inquisition tended to default them to black, and so that's what happened. When on the ground they may have been seen very differently, But the Inquisition taking that is saying, okay, that one dash, just that little blood drop changes everything. And so that tends to be what happens. So even if the practice, and I've seen case after case where truly what was going on was that these peoples of African descent were raised in native communities. Everyone they hung around was native, or at a minimum maybe even mestizo. But because they had a little, just a touch of blackness in them, they're being prosecuted and their magic is seen very differently. Okay, and so it recalibrates syncretism. It skews it because then it denies. It associates an Africanity, if you will, a subversiveness that probably was a very different read. The Inquisition got a lot of things wrong. No surprise, surprise. But they really blew this, and it was really because of mixture and how they interpreted the blood flows. So, in a way, that answers some of your question. Mm-hmm.
I'm Tom Johnson. I teach at UMass Boston and at Bentley University. I'm glad I made all 3 talks, and I can't wait to get the book when it comes out. So I have a question that I don't think can be answered conclusively, so I won't expect you to do it, but it'd be nice to know, have some clarification on your position. And that's what was raised by Ibrahim Sunjata in the discussion yesterday, which is the question of comparison and questions about exceptionalism. You've given us a lot on Mexico and further on Spanish America. Where does this fit into the larger history of the Western Hemisphere, or of, Mestizaje as a global phenomenon? The U.S. is taken to be exceptional in this respect. I'm a strong critic of American exceptionalism at every opportunity. And Gary Nash suggested, in terms of the race mixing, we're not as exceptional as we like to believe. It's just the history has been forgotten. But if you consider the Iberian Atlantic world and the Brazil and Portugal too, Spain is set up apart from the common monarch, many of the common laws, language, and so forth. But there are institutions like the plantation, the Catholic Church, and the institution, plus all of these categories. A lot of the same words appear in Portuguese in Portugal and in Brazil. So are you arguing for a Spanish-American exceptionalism? And if you're not, I guess I would ask you to say, where does the balance lie? Because there are always bases of comparison, but are the differences more important than the similarities?
That's an excellent question, and especially the last part of what you say. I don't have a complete answer to you, and as you prefaced your remarks, the question is in some ways unanswerable. But let me take a stab at it. And because that question was asked in a slightly different form yesterday, I have thought a little bit about this at least overnight and through the day. And one of the things I just wanted to say to this is that, yes, there is a difference in the Spanish-American realm. That difference basically had to do with a lot of what I've been talking about, and that is the space, the mental space, the legal space to tolerate and create these different forms of categorization. Yes, we had a lot of different ways to identify people in what has become the United States and in the British experience, but it was nothing like that. It just did not reach those heights, and so to me that helps seed then this pushes the boulder, if you will, of Mestizaje, and helps explain in some ways divergent paths between what is a North American reality and what is, I would argue the rest of the hemisphere, because I think the North American case is really the small player in hemispheric terms. So it's my thought that particular path does lead and encourage if you will. It provides a different fodder for the ability for Mestizaje to take place. As Alejandro de la Fuente mentioned yesterday as well, just the legacy of mixture. And I don't want to get too deep into that because I think it's a trope in some ways, but that mixture happened continually, habitually. Look, it happened in North America too. Let's be real. The difference was that it was thought about, categorized, processed, and vocalized in ways that didn't happen here. And so that helps create the difference. That helps create the floor, if you will, for what was to come. And so that's how I reflect on it. It's not a complete answer yet. I still have to give it a little more thought. But that's where I'm leaning, given what I've been able to see and write about so far. Thanks, Tom.
Yeah, I want to. Is this on? Yeah. I want to link this up with the first question that Emmanuel asked, because, and maybe we talked about this a little bit after your talk, Ben, on Monday, and that is that the religious intolerance in Spain, that absolute, fitting in or not fitting in, that inquisitorial laser vision that they wanted to develop, seems to me really at the root of this, generating these categories. You have to fit in some category. For Anglo-America, you were either white or not white, right? You may have been mixed or with indigenous and black backgrounds or white backgrounds, but if you weren't white, you were already other. But the anxiety about exactly what kind of other you were that you see in these tables is, I think, really generated by first a religious and then a racial anxiety. I mean, one thing that we talked about was the way that the Inquisition begins as an insistence on getting Jews and Moors into line with Catholic faith, right? And so it was a religious campaign, but when it was clear that you couldn't trust Jews and Moors to just follow one religion, and they were layering, the racial element really kicked in, and you had to be sure where people fit and where they didn't. So it seems to me this kind of anal, archival, parsing of identities has very much to do with this overlay of religious and racial identities. So what do you think about that? Just going back.
No, I think you're spot on. And I did mention some of this too yesterday. Even the way in which the Inquisition and the religious orientation of the Spanish world started to calculate, how much of a Jew you were, or how much of a Muslim you were. That created the actual structure for doing those tables of castes. They're so similar. I mean, it's hard not to fathom the similarity. So I agree. The religion is deep in this particular process. The only thing that I would add is, and as I was also mentioning just a minute ago, is that we do have to remember that over time, the religious zeal, the passion, it starts. In practice, it starts to kind of fade. It's not as strong in the 1700s as it was in the 1500s, and so but then the whole society is different too. So that makes things very different. But in that first 150 years, I mean, this is serious business. And I agree, it has to be factored in. It has to be factored in. So, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm terribly sorry I had to miss the first lecture, but I've now greatly enjoyed the second and third. And I'm going to start with a simple provocative question, and we'll just contrast the U.S. and Mexico. So whose system is better if we project from the period of interest to you to the present? And beneath that is the other question of what difference does it make to have had a much longer durée to a recognized Mestizaje kind of category in your vocabulary and modes of social organization. Because I might challenge you a bit, pointing back to Nash's kind of argument that, you know, there was a heck of a lot of mixing going on in America. And even for some periods, we institutionalized it. You look at the 1870 census, 1880, 1890, you've got white, colored, mulatto, quadroon, octoroon, and we're talking several million people in these categories. As Jim Crow gets institutionalized, 1920, white, black. And you gotta ask, where'd those 4 million people go? You know, they were there and labeled as such in a certain period. And I just, having gone through all this complexity and made a case about Mestizaje and the importance of the Mestizaje category, and we watched the trajectories of evolution that continue through today, who's at a better place? And does having these complex categories, is that the better mode in a way, for some sense of social justice and the great arc of the you know, by and by?
It's a great question, and to my own peril, I'm going to take the bait, just for the purposes of, you know, livening it up at the end of this. But, you know, listen, I mean, look, I have a feeling that you got to judge this by, you know, how people are treated at the end of the day. I mean, look, that's what it's all about. And, you know, a case can be made. All right, and you know,
Here we go.
I can't. I mean, I'm just saying. I'm just talking. You know, a case can be made that, you know, overall the treatment, baseline treatment of people who were not white, they fared better. They fared better. I mean, now the case can be made too that, you know, that stuff comes back to bite you at the end of the day. And we're seeing the social movements that are taking place in Latin America now, and, you know, the social movements that took place with the indigenous, have been taking place with indigenous populations for decades, and now have taken place the Afro-Latino movement and Afro-Latin American movement. You know, that Mestizaje gets you to a point, and then you gotta go to what I call Mestizaje 2.0, which is, and that's, you know, just reboot this thing. Let's get more inclusive in this. You know, let's figure out the lessons. Both parts of the hemisphere, I think, have a little bit to learn from each other in this. And I was talking about this last night with someone, and, you know, the most past 15, 20 years of censuses here in the United States, you know, they make this colonial period stuff look like a joke. You know, I mean, the past couple of censuses, you got 30, 40 different categories we can produce now in the United States. You know, we're not talking about that. So you know, that puts Mexico to shame in its formal structure. So there are things that are happening that are afoot where there's hemispheric convergences. The most important for us thing I think for us to remember is just to watch what happened, I mean, just to learn from the history, just to at least be cognizant of what has gone on, so that we can, you know, create a better future out of all this stuff. Mestizaje has had a lot of problems. Yes, it has. And I'm one of the first to stand up there and say, you know, there are a lot of people excluded, and, you know, my work is dedicated to that, because it has excluded, quite frankly, for years, it has excluded the black voice. Let's be honest. It's muzzled it into, you know, this larger national project, which was necessary to move the region forward cohesively, to get over years of civil war and strife and revolution, and which was needed to build a national populace, a region that was, in the beginning of the 20th century, there were lots of places that had a lot of promise. They couldn't pull it together. It helped move the needle, but something else is needed, and that's kind of where I am. But to take your bait, I say, yeah, Mestizaje probably had a better record, a little bit better track record. So, you know.
So I think that's it. I think it's time to end this and keep thinking about it. Thank you so much for these wonderful lectures.
Thanks. Thank you.